Welcome to the third episode of the new series, The 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness, here on Svarim Chatter, and I'm Nachi Weinstein. In this episode of the series, we discuss one of the ever-present mysteries in the Lost Tribes legend, the legendary Sambatyon River. Where is the river? Do the Lost Tribes live beyond it or next to it? Do the Bnei Moshe live there? Others. Does the river run all week and rest on Shabbos? Or does it rest all week and run only on Shabbos? Is it a river of water? Or perhaps it's a river of rocks or sand? And many other aspects of this river. All this discussed in the episode and more. The corporate sponsor of this series is, as always, Gluck Plumbing. For all your service needs, big or small in New Jersey, with a full service division from boiler changeouts, main sewer line snakeouts, cameraing main lines to a simple faucet leak, Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1. And thank you to them again for sponsoring this third series here on Svarim Chatter. To sponsor an individual episode of this series, please email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, or if you're on the WhatsApp community chat, you can directly message me as well. And as I just mentioned, there is now a WhatsApp community, a WhatsApp chat. You can join that via the link in the show's notes. There's an admin-only one where I post new episodes of the series, new Svarim, new books, and there's also 2 connected chats where there's discussion. Also, there is now a Svarim Chatter Substack, a link to that, which is free, but there is a subscriber option if you like to subscribe monthly or yearly. I appreciate it, and there will be some bonus content for those that subscribe that way. There's general posts, book reviews, things, guest essays, things like that, as well as podcast posts related to the podcast series. And if you would like to write for there and submit anything, you can do so by emailing me, also svarimchatter@gmail.com. To sponsor an episode or support the podcast generally, please email me, svarimchatter@gmail.com, or see the links and information in the show's notes below. Please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on your favorite podcast listening platform. And if you use Apple Podcasts, if you would rate and review it there, write a review is very much appreciated and very helpful to the podcast. And with that, enjoy. And one more thing before I would want to mention Usher Tester of Control A Creative, and thank you to him for his help in Svarim Chatter. We overhaul. There's a new logo for this series, and also for the music for this series. I do want to thank him here publicly. So with that, enjoy this episode about the Sambatyon River and the 10 Lost Tribes series. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast and another episode on the ongoing series on the 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness. On this episode of the series, I'm going to be joined by Dr. Daniel Stein-Kokin, who is a scholar who specializes in Jewish and Christian cultural exchange in the medieval and early modern period, and who is currently affiliated with Arizona State University. And we'll be discussing the Sambatyon River, the famous river, Sambatyon, and we'll be discussing, as very much as it relates to the Lost Tribes, and where it is, and what it is, and where the sources come from, and who's behind it, who lives next to it, and all those many, many more things. So thank you for joining me.
Oh, no, I'm delighted to be here to discuss Judaism's great contribution to the world of mythical waterways.
So let's sort of tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, so as you heard, my name is Daniel Stein-Kokin. I grew up in Los Angeles, lived in a lot of places. Maybe that has something to do with my interest in the Lost Tribes, although I've never moved in search of them, but I have lived in Chicago, in Boston, New Haven, Jerusalem, Yerushalayim, Florence, Italy, Berlin. I now currently live in Phoenix, Arizona, and I think I probably left a place or 2 out. I see myself as an cultural and intellectual historian, though I've had something of an unusual, I would say, odyssey. You could almost sort of say that my professional life, I've been sort of coursing down a river that takes me to different places. I started out in college, University of Chicago, doing classical philology, so Latin and Greek. Then I went to graduate school to study Renaissance intellectual history, Renaissance humanism. I remain interested in the classical tradition, sort of the legacy of the Greco-Roman world. But then somehow my Jewish identity began to sort of insert itself more and more into my academic interests. And that led me to write about Christian Hebraism for my doctorate. So that is Christian scholars in the Renaissance who studied the Hebrew language and Jewish sources, and really just the whole place of the Hebrew language and Jewish-Christian relations. And that remains something that I work on and that I'm a topic that is very dear to my heart and mind. But then increasingly I find myself working on Jewish topics, and I would say that the work that I do, or that I try to do, is characterized by really sort of two tendencies that in some ways are conflicting, but in some ways reinforce one another. So first I would describe as macro textuality. I really love taking particular cultural tropes or traditions and then tracing them across time and space and elucidating how changing cultural conditions impact how exactly they're understood, what is added to these traditions, what disappears, and that whole process of sort of figuring this out across time. I really enjoy, and I find I derive a lot of satisfaction from bringing out the meaning that these motifs have, and that's very relevant for what we're talking about today. And the other tendency I would describe as microtextuality. That is, I really love to do very, very focused textual work, and especially I love just sort of homing in on a sentence or two that often, it seems to me at least, has been sort of overlooked in the literature that's out there, oftentimes because it just says something really strange that it's hard to really make sense of. But then I like to try to really just sort of hover over it for as long as it takes to really make some sense out of it, and then to use that sentence or two as a point of entry, a kind of portal into the world behind that particular text or collection of texts. And then again, to bring out the cultural meaning that's encoded in something that, again, at first glance just seems very strange or impossible to understand, to make sense of. So that's sort of what I like to do, and I really love the working in areas of Jewish-Christian exchange, because I love just seeing how the traditions, the ideas, really bounce off one another, and you can really sort of get a sense of this just fascinating dialogue taking place. I mean, obviously over millennia at this point, but when you're dealing with particular tropes, say sort of the significance of Rome and Jewish culture, or say the significance of the Sambatyon, or another topic that I've worked on is attitudes towards left and right, specifically the discourse surrounding the fact that Hebrew was written from right to left, whereas Latin and other Western languages are from left to right. Believe it or not, there are a lot of sources in the medieval and early modern periods that are trying to grapple with, what is the significance of this? What does it mean that Jews write going to the left, and so forth? A piece that's about to come out deals with Benjamin of Tudela, the great 12th century Jewish traveler's description of Rome, and specifically a very strange tradition that he reports, according to which the palace of Titus in Rome is located outside of the city. Why? Because the Senate would not let him come back to the city after conquering Jerusalem because he took too long to do so. Very strange statement, and trying to figure that out, I ended up writing about 42,000 words. So that's an example of sort of microtextuality, kind of total history or investigation of a particular puzzling thing in a text, and just take it as far as one can take it as long as one can, extract as much meaning as possible from it. So yeah,
now
that's what I'm about.
Yeah, now let's talk about the Sambatyon and the 10 Lost Tribes. I mean, Sambatyon you have a number of articles about, and the 10 Lost Tribes as well. You're working on things. So I don't know which one came first. So because they are linked, but they are separate as well. So I'll let you can talk about a bit about, first of all, just how did you become interested in the topic, and which one kind of came first?
Yeah, I love how you phrase it. What came first, the tribes or the river, the chicken or the egg? So definitely the tribes came first in this case, and really this is one of these interests that have fascinations that I really have had going back even into childhood. I mean, I remember in elementary school, I was just interested in the rulers, dynasties, palaces, legends of ancient rulers. I remember reading it. There was this book in Hebrew school called Legends of King Solomon that I just kept checking out and rereading because I just loved all these stories about Solomon. And I think the tribe sort of latched onto that interest. And I think really what was sort of feeding that, as I look back on it, was this sense of, this questioning, what are my real roots? I mean, grew up in a Jewish family, very typical American, Eastern European background, but we know very, very little about our family history, including really where our name Kokin comes from. We're not Kohanim, so it's not related to Cohen, or if it is, it's incidental. And I think just sort of this fascination for these ancient rulers and dynasties and the tribes of Israel, it allowed me to latch on to something ancient and old and venerable that in a way substituted for a family history that I didn't really have so much. And I'll just sort of on the same line, I remember when I first encountered the Hasmonean dynasty's rulers. I mean, now I know that they weren't really much to write home about, most of them, but I was just fascinated by these names, Alexander Yanai, John Hyrcanus, Salome Alexandra. And that proved to be sort of productive because our second daughter is named Salome. She was born during Hanukkah, and I was sort of inspired by that coincidence, and then all the lovely rabbinic traditions surrounding her reign, and specifically all the rain that fell in it. And I just love the sound of the name. So anyway, getting a little bit off topic there. So back to the Sambatyon and the tribe. So I was just interested especially in sort of where the legend came from of the tribes, and specifically a point that had always sort of bothered me, this notion of there being 10 lost tribes, which we always talk about, but doesn't really make sense from a geographical perspective. Maybe this is coming up elsewhere in the series that you're working on right now, because if we think about the southern kingdom as having been comprised of Judah and Benjamin, then there only really are 9 tribes in the north, unless we include Levi. But of course, Levi was also present in Judah and Benjamin. So, there's the tribe of Simeon or Shimon, who, if you look at all the sort of schemata of where the tribes were located, was located actually sort of in a way in the context of the territory of Judah. So there really weren't. So it's actually complicated to speak about 10 lost tribes. And so I was interested in trying to puzzle out how the idea of 10 lost tribes actually emerged from a literary, historical, whatever perspective you want to look at. I ended up writing a whole long draft about that, which I haven't even published. But in the context of that, that investigation took me to sort of all the different ancient authors and what they say about the tribes. And that brought me to a figure who, in the meantime, has become, I would almost sort of say, a good friend, or at least from a research perspective, because he seems to pop up in so much of what I do, namely Josephus, the great ancient Jewish historian, who has... There's actually a lot of fascinating stuff about the tribes and the specific tradition of 10. We won't go into that here, but specifically, talks also is one of our earliest sources, the second earliest, to my understanding, for the notion of the Sabbatical River. And it was there that I then sort of noticed that that he is writing around the same time as the Roman writer and scientist polymath Pliny the Elder, who in his natural history also makes reference to a river to a Shomer Shabbat river. But as we'll get into in just a moment, the accounts are actually quite different and opposing on numerous fronts, most prominently in the fact that according to Pliny, the river flows 6 days and runs dry every Shabbat, whereas for Josephus, the river is actually dry during the week and flows profusely on Shabbat. So that contrast intrigued me, and really I would say there were sort of 2 things that I spent some time in the context of this tribes piece trying to make sense of that, and that led actually ultimately to my main Sambatyon article from Association for Jewish Studies Review, about 10 years ago. We'll talk more in just a second about that. But there were really 2 things that I noticed or that I learned from engaging with Josephus on the question of the tribes. So first of all, this contrast with Pliny just made me appreciate that, I think generally when we think about the Sambatyon, we think, okay, there's this river that sort of, keeps Shabbat, that is sort of flowing during the week, is dry. And of course, the 10 lost tribes live, on the other far side of it, or live, sort of nearby it in some sense. And I think that's sort of the general picture that we have of the legend. But encountering Josephus and Pliny, I saw, well, actually, the tribes aren't actually referenced at all with regard to them. And they actually disagreed quite, on pretty much everything about this river, except that it is a river and that it in some way, its behavior, its flow somehow is connected with the rhythm of the week and the Sabbath. And that made me realize, there's actually it's not just a sort of a legend that's a set piece. There actually are disagreements. There's actually, the things to explore and figure out about, how people are describing this. And then the other thing is that, so Josephus refers to this Sabbatical river in his Bellum Judaicum, in his Jewish War, Book 7, shortly after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And then it's in Book 11 of his Jewish Antiquities, which is a work that he wrote several decades later, which is a kind of retelling of the Bible and all of Jewish history. And the context there of describing the exile of the Jews, he talks about how, all right, and so basically the two tribes of Judah and Benjamin are, basically all throughout the sort of Mediterranean sort of known world. And then past the Euphrates River, that's where the 10 lost, the 10 tribes are located. And so then I realized, he connects the tribes with the Euphrates, not with the Sabbatical River. And when he talks about the Sabbatical River, he's not talking about any population that lives, in particular, that lives near or past it. And that made me realize, actually, what we tend to think of as a kind of set piece, the legend of the Sambatyon and the 10 lost tribes, seem actually originally to have been two very different stories that at a certain point crossed one another. And that made me realize that there's actually both of these observations, the disagreement between Josephus and Pliny, and then this discrepancy or this contrast in Josephus between where he talks about the tribes and where he talks about the Sabbatical River, made me realize there's actually a story to be told here. It's not a set piece. It's not a set legend. It's a legend that evolves over time, that takes on new meaning. And in fact, we're dealing with that somehow these two legends actually sort of got bound up with one another. So that then raised the question for me, well, when, why, and how did that happen? And what does it mean that it happened? So, and that really got me just interested in tracing the whole history of the Sambatyon legend, because it made me realize that, probably, and I think it's true, in every period where you encounter it, it's doing something somewhat differently. It's being described in somewhat different terms. It's encountering somewhat different difficulties. It reflects Jewish-Christian relations in a somewhat different way. It reflects how Jews think about the Sabbath, and by extension then about the world of Jewish law, of Jewish observance, somewhat differently. It reflects how Jews think about time and keeping time somewhat differently. So sorry, I've probably gone on, speaking of time, I've probably gone on too long there, but that sort of gives you a sense of how I got interested in this and where it's taken me. And that led actually, about a decade ago, my colleague Moti Ben Melech and I, we organized a conference on the Sambatyon that took place at Hebrew University in Yad Ben Tzvi in Israel. And it sort of ebbs and flows, but it remains very much something that I'm interested in. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk about it today.
And with Mati, there's an episode on this series, whether that'll air before this episode or after, but there's an episode with him as well. So I mean, you really give a nice overview of it. I mean, it's a river where, growing up, I always heard of it, and I heard of it one way, but then, like you say, first you look in those, Josephus and Pliny, the classical sources, and you're seeing one says it ran the whole week and stopped on Shabbos, one says vice versa, and then you look in Midrashim, you look in Midrash Tanchuma, you look in Midrash. The Agadat of Shemais, you look in Bereshis Rabbasi, there's all over the place, all of Midrashim, and they all have different ways. Some of them it says it was water, some it was rocks, some it was sand, it was flowed different ways. It moves around, it's in different places, like you said.
Or nowhere sometimes.
Were the 10 tribes on the other side of it? Were they next to it? Was it the Bnei Moshe? It's like, it becomes like there's so much associated. Like you said, it's not a set thing at all. And we're gonna, hopefully get into that a little bit here. So let's start off. I mean, you mentioned, I guess you mentioned the general parameters already. We kind of threw it out there so we can, where's the origins of the river? Where do we see it first?
Yeah. So in the article that I referred to before, I called it Toward the Source of the Sambatyon, because I was, punning on where rivers come from, but also where legends come from. I wanted to try to get as close as I could to where this legend emerged. And one of the main points that I make there, so this goes back to what I was saying about Josephus and Pliny. So noticing how opposed their respective accounts were. And it's not just that Pliny has the river dry on Shabbat and Josephus has the river flowing on Shabbat, but it's also Pliny has the river located in Judea, he says. In Judea, there's a river that runs dry every Shabbat. every Sabbath. Josephus actually has it in Lebanon, flowing from Lebanon into Syria. Pliny talks, has it flowing during the week and then dry on the Sabbath. Josephus starts by having it actually flow on the Sabbath, run dry during the week, and then flow again on the Sabbath. Pliny doesn't actually tell you where specifically it is or where it starts or where it ends in Judea. It's just there. Josephus actually has it very distinctly run from one city to another city. So noticing all these things, it became clear to me that there must be some kind of relationship between these two sources. Can't simply be coincidence that they're reporting things so differently. It can't be that, that somebody just wasn't thinking straight when they wrote and got it wrong. There must be a real connection here. And then that impression was only strengthened when I realized, well, actually, Josephus and Pliny were both in Rome in the years after the Great Revolt. They were both subjects of Flavian patronage, that is the Flavian dynasty, the Emperor Vespasian, Titus, and then Domitian. They were being patronized. They were receiving support for their scholarship from them. So it just made sense that these would be sort of conjoined, and it just seemed also clear from when we know Pliny's Natural History was published, 77, I believe, and when we know or think we know that the book 7 of Josephus's Jewish War was written, that Pliny came first and Josephus is responding to him. And that made sense also. Just Pliny is just sort of a one sentence that appears in a particularly sort of interesting context in his natural history. Josephus really takes a little bit more time to sort of celebrate this this river. And so that led me to the insight, or at least the argument that I make in my piece, which is that the idea of the Sabbatical River really is originally a Roman idea, that it's not something that Jews came up with, it's something that Romans actually came up with, and that it actually reflected or can be placed in dialogue. No, I would say really reflected. It grows out of a sort of a piece of general Roman critique of the idea of Shabbat. And we have a whole host of Roman texts in this period of first century, the Common Era, that that criticize Shabbat for various reasons. That the Jews, they give away 1/7 of their life to doing nothing, to sloth and indolence. That all kinds of critical approaches to the Sabbath. The Romans critiqued the Jews for not fighting on the Sabbath and for the political losses the military defeats that led to in Jewish history and so forth. So the very negative Roman attitude toward the Sabbath, which I think feeds into this idea that, here's a river that there's a river in Judea that basically dries out every Sabbath. It's sort of, in a way, the river is sort of telling the story of the Jews. And that specifically, I would suggest that the legend, this notion emerged during the Great Revolt or in the aftermath of the Great Revolt. Here you have this people that basically, they've been crushed. In Judea. And so this notion of a river that basically sort of, dries out every week in a way sort of tells the story of the Jews, that, they have sort of these periods where they're sort of flowing, but then, it basically leads to a destruction. And precisely the context in which Pliny's passage appears in his natural history, it's a context about dangerous waters, poisonous waters. It's right after actually a reference to this one Roman figure who encountered a spring and then died 7 days later, and so forth. So it's all very suggestive how it's presented there. So that's where I see it coming from. And so then I see Josephus as, in a sense, wanting to respond to this and wanting to actually tell a very different story about the river. And then the rabbinic texts, rabbinic authors also want to tell a very different story about this river. But they're all responding to something that initially, in my contention, grows out of Roman culture. And this also makes sense because we classicists have talked about this. Rivers in various, including in Pliny, but in other contexts, also in classical literature, they're not just geographical phenomena or entities, but they're often used to tell a kind of story. And we actually see that elsewhere in Pliny's natural history, in the context of his description of Judea in general. He talks about the Jordan River, how it's this river of life, this flourishing river that basically, where does it end up? It ends up basically in the Dead Sea, in this body of water that basically symbolizes death and inhospitality and or is inhospitable or poisonous and so forth. And that for him is again a sort of, it's in a way telling the story of this province that the Romans had just crushed and destroyed. So I see Josephus also as very much trying to engage with this sort of Roman use of rivers, again, not just as geographical entities, but also as sort of platforms for telling a particular story about a particular place.
So already in that first time, I mean, and like you mentioned, in many of the rabbinic sources, I mean, it comes all over Midrashim, it's all over Chazal, talk about it, the Sambatyon as well, and we'll talk about that. But, already right there, what you were just saying, you already see, does it flow the whole week, stop on Shabbos, or vice versa? And, there starts being changes about water and the sand and rocks, and it's changing, and also where it's located. Later on, it gets associated with the 10 lost tribes. It's obviously not going to be situated in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. It becomes situated elsewhere. When do all these different shifts? I mean, some have started at the beginning. When do we start seeing these different shifts in its geographical location, its, how it runs, what it contains? When do we kind of see that occurring?
Really from the very beginning. So again, Pliny, he places the river in Judea, but in a very vague, nowhere in particular in Judea. Josephus, as I said before, he has the river actually running between these two cities in Lebanon, one in Syria. Just to resume where I was, so Josephus has it flowing between the city Archaea and then Raphanea. So the first is in Lebanon, today's Lebanon. The second, Raphanea, is in today's Syria. And what's interesting is he notes that Archaea, located in Agrippa's kingdom. This is referring to actually a Jewish figure who had a sort of very small sort of kingdom or polity in the north of the land, just to the north of the land of Israel. So I actually argue in my piece that the story that Josephus's Sambatyon or Sabbatical River is telling is in a way this move from a place of Jewish sovereignty to a diaspora existence, and that the notion that it every 7 days runs full of copious water again is in a way reflecting his anticipation, his confidence, his faith that the fortunes of Jewish history, they ebb at times, but they will again in the future flow mightily. But to get specifically to your question, so already there in our very earliest two sources, we have a real shift in terms of where the river is located. But we have also a lot of sources that are not actually specifically concerned with where the river is located. And that's actually the case with the earliest, what I regard as the earliest stratum of rabbinic teachings about the river, this encounter, this conversation between Rabbi Akiva and Turnus Rufus. They actually have it's the role of the Sambatyon is simply to prove the legitimacy of the idea of Shabbat. The Har Sambatyon Yochiach, the river Sambatyon, will prove that there is, such a thing as Shabbat, that it is that it has a sort of basis. But those sources are actually never interested in clarifying where exactly the river is located. Then, as we head in later in time, we start to see some indications as to where it is, but really what happens is it comes to be located somewhere at the edge of the known world. And I haven't been so interested specifically. I mean, there are different sources that say different things. There's one Muslim geographer in the Middle Ages who actually places the Sand River, as he calls it, in Spain. But typically I would say the sense is that it's located somewhere off to the east. And most of the sources that I've explored have not been particularly interested in saying exactly where it is, but although they do sometimes give indications. So, for example, one interesting source is Avadia of Bartanura, writing in the late 15th century, who reports that he heard from Muslim traders actually that it's located. And it's located basically in the near, well, if you're starting in Yemen, it's located about a 50 days walk into the desert. So on the one hand, it's fascinating because that offers a kind of precision 50 days walk. But of course, 50 days, I mean, it's a very sort of sabbatical, it's basically 7 times 7. So it's sort of a fascinating notion that to get to the sabbatical river, you need to basically walk, sort of 7 times 7. We're doing this interview in the Omer period between Pesach and Shavuot. So that's sort of, so it's interesting to think about, place it in dialogue with the two sort of notions of counting to 50 in dialogue with one another. The river ends up sort of somewhere far away, basically at the edge of the world, and that's sort of where it stays. I would say even down to the present, more or less. I mean, I'm thinking of one of the sort of there are various references to the Sambatyon that appear in Israeli culture or Israeli popular culture, and sort of one example is Ehud Banai's song HaKochav Mi Mechoz Gush Dan, about this beautiful young girl who you won't find anyone like her. He sings from Nahar Yarkon at Sambatyon. You won't find anyone like her from the Yarkon River all the way to the Sambatyon. And from an Israeli context, then the Yarkon is the river that courses down, right through Tel Aviv. So that's like at the very center, and then the Sambatyon is at the very edge. So that's sort of what the river comes to represent. And so the interesting question is then, well, how did the tribes end up specifically there, and how do they end up behind the Sambatyon?
Yeah, so I want to leave that for a second. And first of all, you mentioned the Bartanura, the Rav, Mishnayos, his letters. It's been collected. There's a critical edition. May Ital Yerushalayim, Igorosav Shel Bartanura, May Eretz Yisrael. There's a critical edition. For those interested in reading it, very fascinating letters, as you mentioned. Also, yeah, I totally blanked on the Gemara in Sanhedrin with Rabbi Kiva and Turnus Rufus that you mentioned there. That's kind of what happens when I record these series over time. And I recorded the previous few episodes were recorded like 2 months ago. So I kind of forgot it, didn't review everything for the series. But yes, that Gemara, and like you say, Kiva tells him, you want to see about Shabbos, look at the Sambatyon River. So, I mean, what I want to talk about, as you mentioned, it kind of moves. I mean, how does it kind of move, though? You have the sources conflict. I mean, how does one source really deal with the other source? I don't know if there's an exact answer to this, where it's kind of moving in, even just sticking to any source. I mean, anything. It's just, even Chazal, it's moving all over.
Yeah. So how can we make sense of this? Yeah. So, and that's, it's what I've tried to do in my work. It's maybe easier, somewhat with sources like Pliny or Josephus, where you have a single statement in Pliny, a single statement in Josephus. Yeah. But what do you do in a rabbinic context where you have just so many different sources and so many different texts that are saying so many different things? So what I've tried to do is really to try to organize the various rabbinic texts. And I've come to the view that there basically are 4 main rabbinic traditions about the Sambatyon River, which I think actually can be, we can get a sense of when approximately each one of them originated, which is not to say that you have one source that's talked about for a while and then that disappears and is replaced. No, a source or a particular tradition emerges in a particular context in response to particular challenges, and then and actually then sort of continues to exist for a very long time. But then in response to new changes, a certain other tradition is then sort of codified and then persists. So let me run through these 4 traditions as I see it, sort of briefly, but then I think it might actually make sense for us to step back a little bit, because I think it's also important to bear in mind, and I actually want to sort of emphasize this to your listeners, that of course we're not just dealing with Jewish sources. I mean, this already became apparent with Pliny, but later on we also have Christian sources that are referring, and also Muslim sources that are referring to this river. And sometimes that other material can be helpful because some of those texts we have more precise dates for when a particular text was composed, that it can then assist us a little bit in situating the river with situating the rabbinic sources in time. And there's also another piece that needs to be thrown in, is that in a way, before we even get to the rabbinic sources, there's pseudepigraphic literature, sort of non-rabbinic Jewish literature that is also dealing with the river. And in fact, could actually, as I think through this more, I'd actually love to start there, because I think that enables us actually to sort of to get at this more. Because actually that material, it's actually not so... it's not exactly about the Sambatyon always per se, but about the tribes. And what I want to get at here is that we have actually a very important substitution that takes place. So I said before that Josephus in Book 11 of the Jewish Antiquities has the 10 tribes located past the Euphrates River. And this is actually something that we see in a lot of this pseudepigraphic literature, texts like Tu Baruch from the early 2nd century CE. Or even a little bit earlier, 4 Ezra, 4th book of Ezra from the late 1st century CE, where we have reports about basically how the tribes are located past the Euphrates River. And it's not even necessarily clear that they're just on the other side of the Euphrates River. In fact, it's actually quite clear that they're not. For Ezra talks about how even after crossing the Euphrates, the tribes still had to wander a year and a half until they got to the place that God had destined for them. Also from Tu Baruch, because of various formulations there where it's a little bit unclear, it seems actually quite clear that they're not simply right across the Euphrates, but also somewhat further away. But the point I want to make here is that in around 100, around the year 100, in Josephus, in Tu Baruch, in 4 Ezra, very clear association between the 10 tribes and the Euphrates River. Why the Euphrates River? Because the Euphrates River was a key boundary at that point in time, geopolitically, between the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire. And really, it was in the late 1st century into the early 2nd century that the Euphrates really played this key role, sort of dividing these two parts of the world from one another. And so for Jewish authors who, especially in the decades after the revolt, are keen to sort of hold out hope for some kind of Jewish revival in the future, it's great to sort of imagine, to posit that there's this massive Jewish population on the other side of the Euphrates River that one day is going to be reunited with the rest of us. And Josephus, when he refers to the tribes past Euphrates, he actually sort of in a way talks about how untold masses, and I think he's in a way, sort of implying that there's some real power there that could at a certain future point be deployed. And there are other hints elsewhere. I mean, even at one point in the Jewish War, he refers, he has Titus allege that the Jews were sort of sending out feelers to populations on the other side of the Euphrates, hoping that they would intervene on their behalf. So sorry, I am going to come back to the Sambatyon, but I just think it's important to talk about this because I think I'm trying to chart really how this population or whatever group it is got conflated with the river. And so I think it starts because of this Euphrates tribes conflation that we have. But then at a certain point in time, the Romans managed to conquer territory past the Euphrates as we headed later into the 2nd century. And for various other reasons, the Euphrates actually loses its status as this key sort of geopolitical border, which then results in it making much less sense to talk about the tribes past the Euphrates River per se. I mean, one thing that I forgot to mention is that if we go back to the earliest biblical accounts of where the Northern Kingdom tribes were deported, it was tributary of the Euphrates actually. So that there's actually a very it goes deep back into biblical times, this association between the tribes and the Euphrates in some sense. But what's really interesting to me is that it's the sources that I just mentioned that really emphasize the Euphrates and not a tributary thereof, even though the sources then go on to actually push the tribes, well past the Euphrates. So we already have then in the, around the year 100, this sense, the tribes are sort of located somewhere sort of far out there to the east. And so I think that as the tradition evolved and people wanted to sort of give a sense of, well, where exactly are they? It sort of it sort of made sense in a way to suggest, oh well, there's actually there's this river that, in a way, I mean, sometimes I like to think about it sort of a river without a people for a people without a river, in a sense, to sort of paraphrase this, famous problematic Zionist slogan. So, I mean, you already have this tradition. Well, and here, actually, I need to go back and introduce the various rabbinic strands of the discussion. So let's sort of bracket what I've said thus far, and then I think I'll be able to clarify a bit better how the tribes got conflated with the Sambatyon, and feel free to probe if it needs to come out more clearly. So anyway, so back to where we sort of were going to get before, these four rabbinic traditions about the river as I see it. So the oldest one, it seems to me, is what I like to refer to as the Sambatyon will prove it tradition, Nahar Sambatyon Yochiach, which shows up in a diverse array of rabbinic sources, but always involves, again, this confrontation or this dialogue between Turnus Rufus, the name varies from time to time, and the Roman governor of Judea, and Rabbi Akiva. And to me, the fact that it's always these two figures, whereas we see in a lot of other rabbinic discussions or debates, we often see the exact figures who are credited with particular words or particular positions. They actually vary over time and over source, but this is very fixed, which leads me to think that this was actually quite early on, became a fixed tradition, and goes back to the Tanaim, to the Tanaitic period of rabbinic scholarship. And it's basically this debate where Turnus Rufus, confronts Rabbi Akiva. What is one day from another? In other words, what is it with you Jews and Shabbat? Why do you hold that there's this special day out there? To which Rabbi Akiva replies, well, what is one man from another? In other words, what's so special about you that you have all this, power that other people don't have? And so the Roman governor responds, well, because my Lord, namely the emperor, so desired. Likewise with Shabbat, so my Lord desired it, says Rabbi Akiva. And then the Roman proceeds to say, well, but how can you say that today, let's say, is Shabbat? And one of the proofs that is given is, well, we'll let the Sambatyon River prove it. Again, I think, for me, this only reinforces my sense that the Sambatyon was originally a Roman idea, because he's saying, look, if you Romans, you talk about that there's this river that sort of, dies out on the Sabbath. Well, so there you have it. That's the day. That's Shabbat. But it's obviously a form of a kind of rabbinic response to Rome and to Roman claims of imperial hegemony and world mastery. No, you think, you Romans, that you are in control of everything and that you decide, what time it is and who's who in the world. But no, you do not have complete mastery. There are phenomena that you do not control, that you do not master, and that's precisely what makes Jewish existence and Jewish continuity viable. In a way, it's a kind of parallel to the famous Titus and the gnat or mosquito story, where Titus, celebrating his great triumph after destroying Beit HaMikdash in Jerusalem, it's supposed to be this, incredible triumphant moment, and then this little gnat basically, makes its way into his nose, and the lowliest, smallest of creatures basically undoes the mightiest of human beings and so forth. So it's a similar kind of move that I think is happening there. In any case, so that source, that tradition, the Nahar Sambatyon Yochiach, doesn't locate the river anywhere, because it doesn't need to. It's purely about time. It's about the Shabbat as a particular day. Then the next tradition that, again, from the figures who it's associated with, it seems quite clear that it's an Amoraic tradition that I think goes back to, say, the early 5th century or so, is the three exiles tradition. And this we have a notion that basically there were three great exiles of the Jewish people, and this refers to a pasuk in Isaiah 49:9. And I'll just read this quickly in English, where it talks about, well, I created you and appointed you a covenant people, restoring the land, allotting anew the desolate holdings, saying to the prisoners, go free. So that's the first exile, according to the exegesis at the root of this tradition. To those who are in darkness, show yourselves. They shall pasture along the roads, and every bare height shall be their pasture. That's the third group. So basically, the exegesis of this biblical verse sort of seems to point to the articulators of this tradition that there are three great Jewish exiles. And there, one of them, and sometimes even two of them, are bound up with the Sambatyon River. So that's where we first see the first sort of beginnings of a kind of conflation between the Sambatyon River and some kind of exiled Jewish population, though it's not, it's by no means sort of, complete. Okay. And then the third, which I see is dating from around the same time, Amoraic period, is what I like to call the 10 tribes, 2 tribes tradition. And we see this, for example, in Bereshit Rabbah. Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Rabbi Simon, said that the 10 tribes were not exiled to the place where the tribes of Judah and Benjamin were exiled. The 10 tribes were exiled to across from the river Sambatyon, whereas the tribes of Judah and Benjamin are scattered in all the lands. So here it's in this tradition that we get sort of, in a way, the sort of classic motif that we sort of imagine. I think that most of us, when we think about the Sambatyon legend, okay, there's Judah and Benjamin, the 2 tribes from the southern kingdom that are sort of in the world that we know, and then the 10 tribes there past this Sambatyon River. So what I want to just sort of highlight here is this is in a way basically exactly what Josephus was saying, except that now we've substituted the river Sambatyon for the river Euphrates. Come back to that in just a moment. And then the fourth tradition is what I like to refer to as the Sons of Moses tradition. And this goes back to passages in really to Shmot 32:10, where God, Hashem, gets so angry with Bnei Israel that he basically says, let me destroy them and I'll make of you a great nation. Moshe, let me start over. I'm gonna make a new people. And there's no real indication that that happens in the shot of Shmot, but it sort of nonetheless sort of plants this kind of seed for what then emerges as a whole elaborate legend, the notion that these Bnei Moshe, these sons of Moses who are out there, and well, they need a place, if they're going to exist, they need a place to live. So, well, why not place them, at the Sambatyon? And there specifically, I would say that because, the Bnei Moshe, by virtue of the context in which God decides to create them, are clearly going to be a very righteous, moral, people in contrast with the very problematic exiled tribes. Having them sort of at the Sambatyon in a way sort of perhaps responds to sort of this sense of, well, why do the tribes even merit, to be past this particular river, even though, of course, a lot of the traditions do, in fact, have them there. Okay, so we were getting at the question of, well, why exactly do we get to this point then where the tribes are located then past the Sambatyon? And I think basically, it's hard to say with certainty why something happens. I mean, I think it's already, though, important that we can sort of demonstrate that it does happen historically in time, that are sources that we can actually document the shift that takes place. But I can gander a few explanations. One is a sort of political or religious historical explanation, which is that as the Roman Empire and really as Christianity spreads throughout the known world, as we head really especially into the 4th century and beyond, it's in the early 4th century that the Roman Empire in the West starts to become Christian, but you have Christianity spreading also in the East, and Christianity representing a real challenge to the viability of, claiming to be the new Israel and so forth. The notion that the tribes are somewhere further, further away becomes, even more attractive, and then the notion that you can sort of put them behind this river that is somewhere out there. You don't exactly know where, but in a way, the fact that you don't exactly know where is in a way a kind of safety. It's this kind of guarantee that okay, there is sort of this population that's living free, that's not that's not sort of confronted with this challenge out there. And then the other is sort of a kind of literary or symbolic perspective, which is that already going back to the first strand of these rabbinic traditions, the Nahar Sambatyon Yochiach strand, the Sambatyon there is playing a role as a kind of marker of time, but not specifically space, but a marker of time that redounds to the viability of Judaism as a practice, right? And the notion that the tribes, that the exiled tribes still exist, already, I think we see this already in Josephus, and even before, is a kind of sucker for Judaism to know that, okay, this population has been exiled, but they still exist. They're one day going to be reunited with the people. That also is a kind of testimony to the viability of Judaism, but it's a testimony in space, not so much in time. And so I think these two sort of testimonies that were out there, in a way, became fused. And I like to speak about the Sambatyon as Judaism's space-time continuum, sort of on the model of physics, because it really sort of brings together these two aspects, space and time, in a really nice way. It's sort of, and if we imagine a lot of the depictions of what the people are like who live past it or near it, it's almost sort of messianic in character. So there's almost this sense of like sort of the messianic age in the future. It's sort of there. I mean, it's just, this future time is sort of in another place already on this earth. Again, a sort of space-time continuum, but then also space-time continuum in the sense that, again, the river sort of testifies to the viability of Judaism. This population testifies to this viability of, to the viability of Judaism. And the fact that they're sort of like conjoined, that they're juxtaposed with one another, in a way only strengthens, in a way sort of, the legend becomes sort of it becomes more than the sum of its parts, in a sense. I think one could say. So that's sort of my sense of sort of why this happens. But again, what's fascinating for me is, so the Sambatyon, again, in Pliny and in Josephus, and in the early rabbinic strata, it's not at all a border in any sense, and then it becomes actually, in a way, this very hard and fast border. Though it then somewhat gets effaced a little bit in some of the later accounts, say of the Eldad Hadani tradition, in which, and some others in which you have some tribes are past to somebody, like on our side of the Sambatyon, and some are on the other side. And as we said before, it gets very complicated. Where, and the sons of Moses, B'nai Moshe are there, it gets very sort of a bit complicated. But nonetheless, in general, speaking, roughly speaking, the Sambatyon becomes this important sort of boundary point, separating, in a way, the known world that we experience from this, from this other world, and again becomes a kind of messianic element, in that past the Sambatyon things are very different. There, the Jews are sovereign. There, their conditions are much better. And that's actually another thing that for me is quite interesting, because it strikes me that there are, in a way, sort of two messianic models that Jews are thinking about, in a sense. Across late antiquity into the medieval and early modern periods. There's so the one that we're talking about, the tribes past the Sambatyon at the edge of the world. There's this great reservoir of Jewish power and hope that one day is going to be reunited with the rest of the people. But then there's also this notion that the Mashiach, that the Messiah, is hanging out in Rome. And Rome is the very center of the universe. So you have either these masses, this massive population at the edge of the world, or this sole redemptive figure who's actually at the very center of the world. In both cases, you have this notion that the redeemed future is already, in a sense, present in the world, but just in a very sort of, not yet fully accessible form. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot there with the Sambatyon and a lot to unpack. I think you've covered, a nice amount. I don't know if we mentioned also the pasuk in Malachim, the original pasuk, Vayageles Yisrael, Ashura v'yeshev esam b'chalach v'chover nahar Goizon v'arei madai. So the Har Goizon there, Nick, you mentioned, then it becomes the Euphrates, then it becomes Sambatyon. You're busy with all this kind of, but that's, the first thing that we kind of have. And as you mentioned, with the Eldad Hadani, you have one thing that becomes through there, and then we didn't even mention Prester John. We'll mention Christian and Muslim sources also, that near the river, across the river, Antoni de Montesinos, another part of this series, Menashe ben Israel, where it's the Ruvain is on the other side, and it just, it kind of, lots of different things and get conflated. So I want to get to some other different parts, and I'm sure that we can go on, a lot more here. I do want to ask you one just more general question. I realized that we didn't cover before we get to the other sources and things like that. We mentioned this in the beginning, how some say, it was water, and some said it was sand, and some said it was rocks that were flowing there and starting and stopping. So we've covered kind of its geographical location and how it kind of moved around and where it moved to. We kind of covered, who was behind it, next to it, across it, or when did it run the whole week and stop on Shabbos, or vice versa. But what about the contents of the river? Was it water, sand, rocks? The different opinions on that.
Yes. Well, obviously, great question. This is a critical thing to discuss in the Sambatyon, because it is definitely one of the most special things about the river that, according to a lot of accounts, it's not even water at all. It's sand, it's rocks, as you say. So where does that come from? Well, it's clear that it's not in the very earliest strata, or the very earliest strata of the legend, because it's not something that's mentioned in Pliny or Josephus. And David Kaufman, 19th century scholar, he had very early on proposed that maybe the idea that maybe it was originally a sand river. And, because of hol, sand in Hebrew, that then led to the idea, okay, well, it's flowing with sand, so it's flowing on hol and resting on Shabbat. But it can't be right, because the earliest sources make no mention to this idea. But I do think that it's quite possible that he was, even though he was wrong, he was right. That is to say that this kind of punning on hol, sand and profane, time, the non-Shabbat days, actually maybe does have something to commend it, because this notion that the river, that it flows behol, as we see in some sources, that presumably, certainly originally meant that it's flowing on Yomei HaChol, that it's flowing on during the days of the week, led people to sort of imagine, oh well, it's flowing with sand, it's flowing with sand, and that I think then gives rise. Well, once it's flowing with sand, well, why shouldn't it flow why just with sand? Why not with rocks? Why not make it even more dramatic, and so forth? And that then, and I think that tendency was also fed by a desire to clarify. Well, okay, so if there's this river and the tribes are on the other side of it, well, why don't they do what people do with rivers all the time? Why don't they just cross it and come to us? Why don't we cross it and go to them? Why, if they're out there and there's this river, why can't there be contact? And so what we see, in this, I see this first originating in Midrash Bereshit Rabbati, which it's a complicated text and hard to date exactly, but clearly pre-11th century. That's really, to my understanding, the first place where we see, what I would refer to as a really kind of miraculous account of the Sambatyon. Really, I mean, in all the rabbinic sources that I went through, these four rabbinic sort of traditions, we don't really see any real emphasis on anything particularly miraculous or especially dramatic in the Sambatyon. So again, sign for me that the earliest period of the legend, that was really not really present or important. But just I'll read briefly in Midrash Bereshit Rabbati, and the river was full of sand and stones, and pulled along sand and stones, and made a great noise at night that could be heard for a distance of half a day's walk. And the river pulled along the sand and the stones all 6 days of labor, and rested on Shabbat. And immediately from the onset of Shabbat until the close of Shabbat, fire erupted along the shore of the stream. And the fire raged such that no man could approach within a mile of the stream, and the fire burned every plant along the stream until it swept the ground clean. So it's sort of, you can imagine, so during the week, plants sort of, begin to grow, and then every Shabbat they're burned to a crisp, basically, is, what the source is saying. And there are other sources that talk about fog instead of fire. So, but clearly what seems to emerge as we head into the Middle Ages is this, again, this sort of miraculizing, this fantastical aspect of the legend that, again, it really explains two things: why it is that during the week it's impossible to navigate the river, and also why it is on Shabbat, when it presumably is quiet and ceases to flow and rests, why it's not possible to cross the river then as well. So. Yeah, so as I was saying, basically, so this sort of miraculous element of the river emerges because to explain the obvious question, well, why don't we pass it? Why can't we do that? But it's sort of interesting is that, in a sense, it's an important question. How do we describe the function of the Nahar Sambatyon Yochiach proof in the earliest Strand River rabbinic text? At least some scholars have talked about that the Sambatyon represents a kind of natural law. It's basically rooting the Shabbat in nature, in a sense. If we want to go that route, then it becomes a sort of interesting paradox that this river that's rooting the Shabbat in nature then takes on all these miraculous qualities that are sort of anything but the most non-natural sort of things that you could possibly imagine. I actually am inclined to think that it's problematic to think about the Sambatyon as representing a kind of natural law. I think in a sense it's in a way trying to push against a kind of Roman notion that there is a kind of universal law that that structures, because it wants God ultimately to be in control, and yet at the same time it's willing to make a certain sort of concession to the way that the Greeks and Romans are thinking about nature, because it knows that that's a way that they can, in a way, you can argue with them. And that's sort of what's interesting, is that sort of notion that the Sambatyon will prove, it's only something that comes up in a context in which the sources are clearly imagining, fantasizing the kind of Jewish, non-Jewish controversy or exchange. It's not, other sources like, the 10-2 tradition that, are clearly more internally directed. I mean, they're all internally directed. They're all internal Jewish sources, but it's that one strand is interested in sort of imagining, well, what are you going to say, to the non-Jew who challenges you about Shabbat? The other sources are not so much interested in that. And by the way, that notion of this sort of imagined debate, I mean, that persists, well into the Middle Ages. We have this, this piyut, that we have in the Ashkenazic tradition, Yom Shabbat Kadosh Hu, where you actually, one of the verses actually imagines, hold on one second. Where is it? Yeah, I'll just read here. Zeh ha'ot asher sam el, Shabbat, beino vein b'nei Yisrael, uvashvi'i asher ho'el, Sambatyon hanahar, shebecho yom ratz v'nimhar, yochiach bo manoach, tashiv lemin asher sho'el. This is fascinating for me. Tashiv lemin asher sho'el, that it's sort of, the piyut is in a sense training you, for when you, in the marketplace encounter the Christian who, what is this Shabbat nonsense? And it's doing it, it's replaying in a sense the Turnus Rufus Rabbi Akiva debate, but instead of, an elite Roman and an elite rabbi, it's now you and, your Christian neighbor basically, encountering each other on the street. Anyway, so we want to get though to this whole question of like this sort of how the river takes on these miraculous qualities. So it's obviously there to explain, why can't they cross to us? Why can't we cross to them? It's also perhaps, I think engaging with these Christian traditions of the kingdom of Prester John, which is also, the Christians also had in a way their kind of parallel tradition, which is that there's this vast, sort of sovereign Christian empire, way off in the east. And Christians, when they thought about the 10 tribes, being off somewhere in the distance, past this river, they imagined, well, that's where the realm of Prester John is located, and basically there the tribes are subjected to Prester John. So it's sort of in a way fascinating that both Christians and Jews, as what they imagine is out there at the edge of the world, they imagine sort of the perfect version of the world as they imagine it. So for the Jews, it's of course these Jews are living there free, they're living beautiful, perfect halachic lives, they're safe. The Christians imagine, no, they're under our sovereignty. We're in charge there, and we have guards posted along the river. That's what's preventing them from coming back to you guys, or preventing you from going to them. So it could be that you could also see these sort of miraculous, all these features as a way of sort of responding to or engaging in dialogue and dispute with these Christian traditions. The Jews, of course, much better to have sort of these miraculous, sort of clearly sort of God ordained miracles that take place than Christian sentries who are standing guard. So but the fascinating thing, in a source like Midrash Bereshit Rabbati is that it's not a halachic argument. Actually, it's not, oh, the river rests on Shabbat, but, it's Shabbat. We can't, because of Tchum Shabbat, we can't actually, the tribes can't cross or we can't cross. No, it's because of this fire, it's because of this fog, it's because it's actually physically impossible to cross the river. And this to me is another fascinating sort of shift that clearly takes place, that we can see it in the source material, from this sort of miraculous description of the river to a more halachic description of the river, because we find as we head into the early modern period, at least on my understanding, these miraculous sources, they start to fade away. It's not that they're not the Eldad Hadani material in which a lot of these things appear. I mean, these texts are still circulating. They're being they're being formally printed, for the first time and so forth. So they're around. But the new source material that emerges as we head into the late Middle Ages, into the early modern period, to my understanding, speaks in very different terms and is not talking about, this physical impossibility of crossing, but is instead talking about the halachic impermissibility of crossing. And that's really quite a fascinating shift. Yeah, so one of the earliest sources in this vein, I referenced it before in a different context, Rav Ovadia Bartanura's second letter from 1489. So we talked about how he locates the Sambatyon in the desert, a 50 days walk from Aden in Yemen. But he talks there about, it encircles, surrounds like a thread the entire land in which the Israelites dwell. It hurls stones and sand every weekday and does not rest except on Shabbat. And this brings it about that if a Jew is traveling in this land, he's not going to, lo yachalel Shabbat, he's not going to desecrate Shabbat by crossing the river. And thereafter, then, we see more and more sources in this vein that then leads to a different kind of challenge, which is, if it's merely, halachic restriction that's preventing, people from crossing the tribes or us from crossing the river, well, surely for pikuach nefesh, why couldn't the tribes then come and actually redeem us? And that, which, is obviously an important question. But before I get to that, I want to sort of try to play around a little bit with, what accounts for this shift exactly? Why this move in this halachic direction? A few things I want to say about that. One, I'm oversimplifying a little bit because there is this whole other set of legends that are like the Alexander romance. And we do have a text from the mid-14th century in which we have an encounter where Alexander and his army, they're at the edge of the world, they come to the Sambatyon, they want to cross. Alexander sends this Jew Menachem across the river to negotiate with the 10 tribes to see about letting him pass through their realm en route to further conquest. And the tribes, they get really angry at this Menachem, like Mapitom, what did you desecrated Shabbat? How did you do this? And Menachem tries to sort of, I was scared. They were all gonna cross, and I'd be left alone with these wild beasts on the other side, and then so I didn't want to do that. So pikuach nefesh, and that's nonsense. You didn't really need to fear from these wild beasts. And so there is. But it's sort of an isolated source, and it's referring to an ancient, something that happened in the past. It's not actually grappling. It's, so far as I can tell, it's in the 15th century that you really start having texts that are sort of grappling in the present with, it's for halachic reasons that the tribes can't cross or that we can't cross to them. And so why does that happen? One thing that I find interesting in the Ovadia Bartanura letter, later in that same letter, he refers to the addressee of his letter. He says, you were asking me all these signs and miracles that people say you have on Har HaBayit, on the Temple Mount, and in the burial caves of our sages, Eretz Yisrael and Land of Israel. And how shall I respond to you? I haven't seen any wonders. What you heard about candles in the temple that flickered and went out on the 9th of Av, yeah, people talk about that, but I didn't really see much proof. And he basically says, ultimately sort of concludes this whole section like this is all nonsense, and wise men like you should be more careful in assessing the truth of matters and not falling for tall tales. So that leads me to wonder if there isn't perhaps something of a just general civil, cultural shift that's taking place that obviously Ovadia Bartanura, he still, seems happy to entertain the notion of the sabbatical river off 50 days walk into the desert, but it's not, the tendency is not to sort of overly emphasize the miraculous nature of it, with all these fires and fog. So perhaps what's sort of happening is that there's just sort of a tendency not to think in such, again, fantastical terms. And so, the halacha makes, is sort of there as a kind of substitute. It's also sort of fascinating in terms of, what it does for the meaning of the legend, because it basically says that actually the legend then, it's not only about sort of, providing a kind of proof for the viability of Judaism, but it's actually sort of about sort of guaranteeing the sort of stability of the overarching state of Jewish existence or the halachic system, let's say. Like, it's not, yes, we know that that there's a kind of, on the other side, there's sort of the messianic realm, but it's not something that we can bring about. The halachic system is basically, it's ordained, it's staying the way it is, because the implication, right, if it's merely for halachic reasons that the river can't be crossed, it's basically, well, in a sense, the Jews could redeem themselves if only they would desecrate Shabbat. If only the tribes would break Shabbat, they could come and redeem their brethren, or we could we could go to them. But no, the legend seems to be sort of, in this new halachic guise, seems to be sort of insisting on the maintenance of the halachic world order, so to speak. And so, but that, as I said, that gives rise then to this challenge, and we hear this in Christian sources, beginning, so far as I can tell, beginning in the 16th century. Why is it, you guys say that there's this river out there, this is all nonsense, if they, because you guys, you claim that you're oppressed and treated poorly here, in Christendom. Well, why don't these people come and rescue you? Why can't they, why can't they save you? Can't they cross in order to save you? Again, the pikuach nefesh argument. And so, just to give one example, this Christian author, Victor von Karben, writing in 1508, he has a Jewish voice saying, well, the Sambatyon rages so wildly during the week, we can't cross it. It quiets down Fridays at 6 o'clock in the afternoon until Saturday at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. But we can't, Friday we don't have enough time to cross it because it's too wide, and on Saturday we can't. Otherwise the Red Jews would have, and this is a different population, this emerges in the Middle Ages, this notion of these Red Jews. We can say more about them if you want. They would have come long ago and liberated us. And the Christian says, well, you damnable Jew, are you not ashamed of your evident lies? How many Jews have traveled since time immemorial from all countries, and often been on sea for months, weeks at a time, including on Shabbat. And wouldn't it be justified for them to break out one Shabbat to come and free you and to liberate you and save you from your oppression? This is all nonsense. So this is actually a key shift that happens in the Middle Ages. Christians and Jews, they seem to agree that the river exists. Head into the early modern period, the Christians are saying, no, it doesn't exist, and the Jews are still trying to hold on to its existence. This is an imagined dialogue, that a Christian imagines, and you can sort of see that in the way that he, actually very interesting what he does with time here, where he says, well, the river comes down Friday at 6 o'clock, but we don't have time. There's not enough time on Friday for us to cross it. So very strange, obviously Shabbat starts, Friday in the evening. But so anyway, but what I wanted to sort of say really here about the halachic issue is that it's really not clear from a halachic perspective, like as he does bring up here. Jews were traveling on boats on Shabbat, and if we go back, as he seems to be talking here, and some of our early modern sources again do have the river, seemingly as a waterway. You could actually, seems to me, navigate it on Shabbat. It's not clear that really halachically speaking, that you couldn't actually cross the river. So I think that we're dealing almost in a sense with a kind of pseudo or almost popular halachic notion, in a sense that, again, it's not so much about the specifics, impossibility from a halachic sense of crossing the river, but it's more what this whole river represents in terms of, again, maintaining the overall halachic order, insisting upon the overall stability of the Jewish sort of situation in the world. And that's really where I think it makes sense to bring in the Akdamut legend, which is, of course, very famously conjoined with the Akdamut prayer of Shavuot, and is, claims this is a legend that basically claims to explain how the famous piyut that's chanted on Shavuot emerged. And basically the main, just summarize very briefly, the legend is that the Jews of Worms were threatened by a Christian magician, and the community was going to be, I believe, exterminated or was threatened with destruction. And so what did the Jews do? They dispatch a group of rabbis to the Sambatyon, to the 10 lost tribes, and right before crossing the river, the one particular rabbi, so Rabbi Meir Schatz, he's gonna he says, oh, okay, I will cross alone. Let me cross. And then, he's immediately arrested by the tribes on the other side for having, desecrated Shabbat by crossing the river. But then he explains that, in fact, his community is in dire straits, and is, people are going to be killed. And so then, actually, he's released from prison, and the community of the tribes, they actually dispatch one of their own who's skilled in the magical arts, to go back to Worms to basically engage in a kind of magical contest with the Christian magician, and basically the town, the Jewish community is saved. But of course, Rabbi Meir needs to stay where he is because he can no longer justify crossing the river. And so, in a sense, the whole Akdamut story is the story that proves the rule, which is that that you can't. Okay, so there's a very specific context, for a very particular operation. Let's say, it's permissible. But in the end, the legend basically, reaffirms the Jewish, the halachic order, in compelling Meir Schatz to stay, on the far side of the Sambatyon. And I see this legend, and here I'm perhaps, this requires, I think I can prove that this all works. But here I'm suggesting that a legend like the Akdamut legend is really emerging to respond to this Christian challenge that about the pikuach nefesh that really emerges once we get this shift from a miraculous depiction of the river to a more halachic depiction of the river. And this goes against, in a lot of the scholarship on the Akdamut legend, it really is pushed back deep into the Middle Ages. But it's not. But it seems to me that in the version in which that involves the Sambatyon, it really actually is sort of emerges in the 16th century, to the best of my ability to determine, and in that sense fits very well the sort of the historical reconstruction that I'm proposing.
Now, I mean, listen, we covered a lot. There's a lot more to cover, but I guess we'll leave it at that, more or less. But what I do want to ask you about is, throughout the centuries, after this especially, I mean, it pops up all over. We didn't really mention, you mentioned Prester John stuff. I don't know if there's any other Christian or Muslim sources you want to mention, and also in general, Jewish sources where you have Ravram Varisol, Azari de Rossi's Marianayim, David Gans and the Tzemach David, Ravram Yogel, Menashe ben Israel, or mention that it will be Antonio de Montesinos' story of Menashe ben Israel's in his Mikveh Yisrael, Hope of Israel. There's that as well, and etc. I mean, so you, I guess, talk about kind of both the Jewish sources that I mentioned and others that you want to mention, and Christian and Muslim sources, how the Sambatyon continues to come up throughout the centuries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and just also we mentioned a little bit Christian and Muslim sources, but just also there is the Bnei Moshe, they appear in the Quran, and there are some. There is some Muslim exegesis of the Quran that actually sort of connects the places that Bnei Moshe on a sand river, which is clearly that has sabbatical nature. So clearly Muslims are aware of this legend. There's a story that appears in the 1001 Nights about a brass city that's located near a sand river. That again, it seems clear that it's the same legend that we're talking about. So the legend comes up there as well. One of the other things I want to say, though, about the early modern period is that there's another real challenge that emerges in the early modern period with regards to the Sambatyon, and that is that in the age of explorations, I already sort of talked about how Christians are sort of in a way pushing Jews on this halachic issue. Why don't they come and save you? But there's another point of pressure here is that in the age of exploration, the world map is gradually being filled in more and more, and I think it becomes sort of harder and harder to really, or there's, it becomes a bit more difficult to say, somewhere at the edge of the world there is this river. You could, in the Middle Ages, it was clear that there were these vast reaches of the world that, beyond what we knew. But in the early modern period, that starts to really change. And so one of the things, and that's sort of in a way responded to in sources. One, we encounter sources that are talking about, that allege, the tribes of the Red Jews, they're on the march. They've now started crossing the river. The river has actually stopped moving. So that's in a way of trying to sort of say, okay, there is something happening here that confirms that the river in fact exists. But to me, what's even more fascinating, and this is something that again we only really start to see in the 15th, 16th century 16th, 17th centuries, so far as I can tell, is that you start to get testimony reporting the presence, the existence around Europe of alleged vials containing Sambatyon water or sand or a mix thereof. And the allegation being that, well, during the week, if you sort of look at this vial of, liquid or sand or whatever, it's all sort of frothing and moving violently. But on the Sabbath, it calms down. And this actually, it comes up actually in Menashe ben Israel's Esperanza de Israel, Mikveh Yisrael, where he reports actually there was a guy, what's fascinating, and it comes up in Avraham Yagel, the Italian polymath. And it's the way that sources, though, reference it, it seems never to be that somebody says, well, I actually have one of these, or I saw it, but it's, Yagel says, in the time of my learned grandfather, a bottle was brought, with this sand, and it was in movement 6 days. Or Menashe ben Israel, he says, well, there's this guy who reports that there was this guy. So it's sort of, no one wants to come out and say, I have one of these, but it seems sort of in a way, again, because the legend, it actually did respond to real Jewish insecurity of a very deep nature, that people wanted to sort of hold on to it in a way. And one of the ways you could hold on to it was by saying, well, actually, there are traces of this special water or sand or whatever it is that are out and about in the world as we know it. And really the most fascinating thing, well, actually, I'll just say two things about this. So in the source of Menashe ben Israel, in Esperanza de Israel, or Hope of Israel, he actually reports that so it was in Lisbon in Portugal that there was a glass filled with the same sand, and every Friday evening at the time of the onset of the Sabbath, this guy who had it was actually a Muslim. He would walk to the street called the Rua Nova, the new street where the forcibly converted Jews lived, and he would basically show them the glass and say, "Okay, close your shops, Jews, for the Sabbath has already begun." So the Sambatyon becomes a kind of like timekeeper in a sense, and it reflects sort of early modern notions of time, more precise clocks. It's like, okay, here you see this Sambatyon, water or sand. It's not moving anymore. Okay, Shabbat has come. Time to close your store. So there's that, and then even more fascinating is some sources from 18th century Germany that report that in the community of Frankfurt that there was actually one of these specimens of Sambatyon water or sand was actually kept in the Beit Knesset next to the Arona Kodesh, and that basically and that the Chazan in the shul would basically sort of show it during Kabbalat Shabbat services. And so I'm just reading from one of these passages. And when the Chazan begins L'chadodi, he pulls aside the curtain, and one sees the water in the glass actively bubbling. The glass itself inclines to and fro, and the water pushes some red sand and small stones over itself. And then so everyone sings L'chadodi. And then when the water ceases in its movement to some degree, congregation starts to calm down, and then basically it comes to a complete rest, and then you move into Baruch Hu and start Mari. So the Sambatyon becomes a kind of holy relic, according to these reports, in the Frankfurt synagogue. And this also raises a fascinating question that we have a lot as historians to deal with our sources is how reliable are they? Is this testimony, we have it in a few Christian authors, is it actually is it reflecting is it true testimony to what was going on at the time, or are Christians in a sense having fun with this legend and elaborating it and taking it in in directions, perhaps even Jewish converts who know enough about it that they can actually elaborate. One of the sources actually that's reported in these sources is in fact a Jewish convert that we know of, who claims that he was the guy who was sort of holding this vial of Sambatyon water and sand and sort of manipulating it to sort of make it sort of move violently and so forth. So again, to what degree are these Christian sources like casting like precious light into a Jewish tradition or practice that we otherwise don't know of, or to what degree are they, as Protestants who sort of in a way love to make fun of sort of ridiculous Jewish and Catholic practices, in a sense sort of exaggerating what to them was already a strange legend in order to sort of, from their perspective, strengthen, enhance their arguments against Judaism. Okay, so what I want to just sort of jump now just sort of to where the Sambatyon is, more or less in our day and age. And here I just want to be sure to end with, or just about end with, a novel from the year 2000 by the famous Italian linguist and novelist Umberto Eco, of In the Name of the Rose fame. His novel Baudolino is, and Eco knew all these traditions backwards and forwards. And it's really amazing. I mean, non-Jewish author who had full mastery of all the sources that we've discussed and others, and basically creates a kind of decent burial, I would almost say, for the Sambatyon River. That is to say, he basically manages to synthesize a lot of these different traditions. And so the novel basically takes place in the Middle Ages. It involves sort of a mostly Christian group, but there's this Rabbi Shlomo or Solomon who's sort of tagging along with them, who is talking to the group about the 10 lost tribes in the Sambatyon. And eventually, toward the end of the novel, they actually make it to the Sambatyon. Of course, they're too late for Shabbat, so it's already Sunday. And they spend that week basically surveying, doing a reconnaissance mission along the full length of the river. They try to go to the source of it, thinking that they might be able to, cross it there, but it's such a steep, complicated canyon, they can't. And then they walk all the way to where the Sambatyon basically ends by sort of collapsing into the abyss of the earth. And so that's why I say Eco is very self-consciously is sort of like trying to put this whole, 2 millennial, legend in a way to rest, to give it a decent burial, as I said. And he actually, has the Jew cross, but he comes up with a very ingenious solution. How does the Jew cross? Because the Christians basically sort of strike him and knock him out. So they basically carry him across the river more or less against his will. But that's how they managed to get him across. So it's actually sort of lovely how this legend that, for centuries was sort of, a flashpoint of Christian-Jewish debate and controversy, in this novel from the year 2000, from this millennial year 2000, that's become sort of this ecumenical moment where the river is finally crossed by a group of Christians and this, and this one Jewish figure who cross together. And just the last thing I want to say about this is that in describing this river, Eco and his translator into English, William Weaver, famous translator of Italian literature into English, they pushed their respective languages' petrologic and chromatic vocabularies to their limit. So if we think about the Sambatyon as in a way pushing nature in a way to the limit, and we've seen some of the miraculous accounts of it in this talk, just want to read this one passage where Eco and Weaver refer to the incessant retching of granite, an eddy of bitumen, a sole undertow of alum, a churning of schist, a clash of orpiment against the banks, and the reddening of haematrites and cinnabars, the fading of leothargirium into saffron ever paler, the belching of greenish earth that faded into dust of chrysocolla and then transmigrated into nuances of indigo and violet. This is how he's describing all the stones and their respective colors that we find in the Sambatyon River. So, and I think that's basically a good place to close, again, with this famous contemporary novelist who, in a way, again, I think very self-consciously was trying in a way to sort of tie up all the loose ends of this legend. It's the one place in the whole literature where you have a party actually sort of survey the entire course of the river from its start to its finish. But of course the legend, lives on, and I think people still find it fascinating. I think there's still a lot of tremendous creative potential to do stuff with it. And it certainly lives on in my household because it's the name of our Wi-Fi account, Sambatyon, which I think is sort of a good use for it also. All right.
Yeah, someone's driving through Arizona. I guess they'll find the Sambatyon Wi-Fi. They'll know it's your Wi-Fi. But yeah, listen. I mean, it still comes up. I mean, it comes up. It's in rabbinic sources. It's in Chazal. People see it. It comes up all the time. Everyone knows about it. Like Thomas we mentioned and things like that. So. I wanted to ask you just also about reading. You can suggest to listeners. I think you have a couple of things that you've written. There are others. Like, where can you point listeners who want to read more about this topic? Yeah.
So let's see. So I mean, I mentioned my piece that appeared in AJS Review toward the source of the Sambatyon. And which deals really with the early period. We're still working on, hopefully papers from the conference that we put on will still come out. These things take a while, but we're working on it. I would recommend an author like the German scholar Rebecca Voss, who's she's really a scholar specifically on the Red Jews, but has also written on messianic sort of debates and interactions between Jews and Christians. So some of this material comes up in her work. Moti Ben Melech, who is a scholar specifically of Shlomo Molcho, the Messianic Pretender, and David Reubeni. I would recommend his work as well. And I think and then also work on the 10 tribes in general. I mean, a lot of these things come up there. Tzvi Ben-Dor Benite, his work on the 10 Lost Tribes, so 10 Lost Tribes of World History, I think it's called. That comes up. I would also mention the work of Micha Perry, University of Haifa professor. And I think, there's more stuff I can mention, but I think already that material, if you look in all those places, that's already going to take you to a lot of the classical sources will be cited, one way or another in that material. And I still hope that some of the stuff that I've written that deals with the later periods, a lot of it I haven't actually had a chance to really, tie up, finalize, and publish, including the bit about Umberto Eco's Baudolino that I hope one day will appear as a final Eco, punning on Eco's name and the fact that he's sort of, in a way, the last great source, at least thus far, on the Sambatyon.
Yeah, and I'll link the other ones you mentioned, and I think all those are a part of the series. Rebecca Voss, Moti Ben Melech, Tzvi Benit, and Micha Perry. So, listeners will hear from them and link to their things as well, but I'll link to it here as well. And just, finally to tie it all together. So the Sambatyon, I guess it's kind of, so how's it kind of viewed in your mind? It's kind of, besides, again, just kind of viewing it, besides for, of course, being in all the sources, as we mentioned, and the Midrashim and Chazal and everything like that, but it's kind of, it's this demarcation between the secular and Jewish, it's between Jewish and non-Jewish, it's between Messianic device, you mentioned, like, it's a time thing, like, how do you, just tying it all together here at the end, once we had this whole long conversation about it?
Well, I love thinking about it as this, as this border in space and time, and just to recapitulate some of what you said, it's a border between Kodesh v'chol. It's a border between Jew and non-Jew. It's a border between the world that we know and the world that we don't know. It's a border between Jewish and non-Jewish. It's sort of, and again, I think for me, what's just always been fascinating and again fun now even in this conversation is just thinking about all the different permutations that ultimately it all is a kind of one long reflection on, in a sense, what does it mean to be Jewish? And what is the situation, the position of Jews in the world? And how do we defend ourselves, as Jews against those who, in history and perhaps in the present see us as outmoded or unjustified or or ridiculous or it's sort of the Sambatyon is in a way in all of its different incarnations is responding. To these various challenges, whether it's concerned with halacha, whether it's concerned with the Jewish political or geopolitical fortunes, whether it's concerned with how do Jews think about time differently from non-Jews and so forth. So I think just for me, what's just exploring these sources and trying to unpack them, contextualizing them, and again drawing out what are the questions that they're trying to answer. How are they trying to make sense of the Jewish situation in the world? That's ultimately what I think legends like this are doing, and I think that's part of why they continue to reward us, as we explore them today. Even if we know that again, today the map of the world is really filled in. Look on Google Earth for the Sambatyon, or Google Maps, you won't find it, but it's still it's still productive, I think, to grapple with this notion of some other realm, some other possibility that's out there.
Absolutely, and the Seres HaShvatim, as we've been discussing 10 Lost Tribes here, in this part of this overall series. So I will link to the material that you mentioned before and the show's notes. The listeners can check that out, and hopefully this was informative. And just the tip of the iceberg, really, there's so much more to go into these primary sources, to look into them and to look more into the Sambatyon. Like I said, it's something that's especially a lot of this is 10 Lost Tribes overall, but especially unique how it changes when it runs, when it doesn't run, what its contents are, where it is. I mean, there's so many things that are just changing in all the different sources. So this was just as long as we went, this was just like an overview, and there's a lot more to discuss. And thank you, Dr. Stein-Kokin, for joining me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much for the invitation. Thanks for referring to the tip of the iceberg. I love that you continued with a water metaphor right to the very end. Thanks so much.